Okay.
To get a message.
Well, hi, everyone. Thank you, Maria. I'm Karen Travers. I'm a consultant here at Halloran. I focus primarily in the data and technology area, but I do go across to some clinical operations and compliance, and big focus this year has been data integrity. And I'm joined by my colleagues here, and in a few moments, I'll ask everyone to introduce themselves. But before we start, I just wanted to do a few housekeeping issues. Just in case anyone isn't exactly sure where you are, you have joined today's clinical roundtable, implications of the FDA's final guidance on informed consent. And we have our esteemed Halloran Consulting Group leaders here, Krista Tibbs, Megan Patterson, and Laura Gillum. We do have all our participants on mute just to minimize any background noise and distraction. If everybody isn't familiar with Zoom yet, there is a chat feature for questions. We'll do our best to answer everything in real time, but we've also left time at the end for questions and any discussion that we would like to have. We expect this session to take about 60 minutes, including Q&A. And we're also going to have 3 poll questions at the beginning, just to kind of level set on where we are. So I think, as Maria said, in fact, I don't think I know, the session is being recorded. I hope everyone got that notification. And now I'm going to ask our panelists to introduce themselves. So we'll start with Krista and then go over to Megan and finish up with Laura.
Hi, I'm Krista Tibbs. I work in our clinical development and operations group here at Halloran. I started in industry back in 1998, and I am very excited to be sharing strategies today with all of you on the line, and hearing from you as well, because I worked on the site, CRO and sponsor side, and on the site side have consented many patients. So happy to see some of the FDA guidance coming around to what we had hoped would make consent more understandable for patients. So happy to be here.
Thanks, Krista. Hi, everyone. I'm Megan Patterson. I'm a senior consultant here at Halloran and mostly sit in the organizational and quality space at Halloran in terms of some activities. But I think in terms of this panel, have a ton of interest and background and kind of patient-centric approaches and patient engagement. And then, I was happy that Karen had mentioned earlier some of the data integrity, which I think as we think about informed consent as a process and the form itself and the collection of that data, it's going to be really interesting to think about data integrity, in this space as well as we move forward. So thanks and happy to be here.
Hi, everybody. I'm Laura Gillum. I'm also a consultant at Halloran with the Organizational and Quality Solutions team. I have over 10 years of clinical research experience, initially focused on clinical site operations, and then more recently, over the past 3 years, fulfilling roles focused on regulatory compliance. So I've seen a lot of informed consent processes and the documentation around that. So I'm excited to talk about this updated guidance. Thank you.
All right. Thanks, everyone. As I mentioned, the guidance we're digging into today is informed consent, guidance for IRBs, clinical investigators, and sponsors, which was launched just this past August. So it's very new, and I'm sure everyone's trying to absorb it all. For anyone who isn't familiar with it, we are dropping that link to that guidance right in the chat, if it isn't there already, I think, Maria. As I mentioned, we do have everyone on mute, but we also want this to be interactive. So please feel free to ask questions through the chat. Drop your questions, raise your hand, whatever you need. And like I said, we also have time at the end for questions. But before we really dig into the discussion, wanted to understand a little bit about our group here. So we do have a few poll questions. So I think, Maria, can you launch those? Yep, here they are. So we're looking into one, have you even read the guidance yet? And then what are top inspection findings and what are you looking to learn today?
I see some answers rolling through, Karen. We'll just give it a minute.
Okay.
Yeah. We still have answers coming through, so just,
Okay.
yeah. All right, I'm gonna, oh, here's some more.
It's good. It means everyone's engaged.
Yeah, that's great. All right, I'm gonna end the poll and share the results with everybody. And Karen, if you want to
Okay.
just walk through these.
So just about split on reading the guidance or not. So I think that will have some interesting discussion. And okay, almost 50% of people seeing inadequate documentation of the consent process. And we're going to talk a lot about that. So I think that will be great. I think it looks like we have most people interested in the implications of the guidance and best practice around delivery. So hopefully, I think we will touch on all of those. Okay, so let's get started. The guidance on informed consent really addresses many specific requirements, as well as the process considerations for IRBs, clinical investigators, and sponsors going forward. So we're going to get into those key requirements and takeaways from the guidance. Laura, let's start with you and kind of get your perspective to start with.
Sure. Thanks, Karen. Really, the overarching takeaway of the updated guidance is that informed consent isn't just a form, it's a process, really, that involves clinical, quality, and data perspectives. And this process is really about patient engagement from start to finish, with the 8 basic elements of informed consent required to meet along the way, as outlined in the CFR. The updated guidance really expands what I would say on 3 key takeaways to facilitate the participants' understanding of research activities and also streamlining communication between study personnel and the participant. The first key takeaway is that it's important to facilitate the participants' understanding of that informed consent material. So the FDA recognizes the barrier, which I'm sure we've all experienced, of those lengthy paper consent forms, and they're really promoting the use of visual aids to facilitate that understanding with the participant, from the processes involved in the trial to the investigational product, and that ultimately the IRB is responsible for reviewing and approving that material to ensure it encompasses the adequate wording and appropriate content. The second takeaway is really focused on streamlining the communication. So the informed consent process is really an ongoing exchange of information between the participant and study personnel throughout their involvement in the trial. And it's really the responsibility of the sites to manage any sort of update and communicate changes to study results or significant new findings. And in this update, the FDA defers to the IRB to determine when and if enrolled participants should be provided with any new information. And the IRB decides if the participant needs to affirm their participation with that new information, if that's applicable. And the FDA is also promoting summary information sheets for updating participants on trial information and really outlining more clearly parameters around when reconsent is needed. And then I would say the third takeaway is having the informed consent process and how it can be adapted to unique circumstances. So the FDA calls attention to really inclusion of targeted populations involved in clinical research, specifically highlighting children, non-English speaking participants, and also cognitively impaired participants. And the updated guideline really outlines key expectations for addressing the prospective participants' unique needs and really ensuring that the consenting process they are involved in the consenting process, and emphasizing the importance of a potential participant's involvement in the informed consent discussion, even if they're not going to contribute to that informed consent decision, which in some instances, like when a legally authorized representative is required. Thanks, Karen.
Thanks, Laura. So with the focus really now on the process, Meg, could you talk a little bit about what other materials and approaches really help facilitate the understanding of a trial?
Yeah, no, absolutely. And Laura, I was so excited to hear you say, really kind of focusing on consent as a process. I think a lot of times when we think about consent, it starts with the form, but it's really critical to think about it as a full process. And that process really starts before the signing of a consent form and really continues and extends beyond that. It's supposed to be that dynamic and continuing exchange of information between the research team and a participant. And I think that requires a bit of a mind shift, a patient-centric mind shift. But I think with that shift, it really allows for sponsors to think about a plan for consent, from early in protocol development right through to study closeout. I think it also allows the site team and the sponsors to think through potential methods and materials and approaches to informed consent, with the ultimate goal of, making sure participants have a clear understanding of the trial, but also for patient engagement and true patient engagement. So as we think about some potential approaches around process, we've seen some sponsors create advisory panels, really which serve to provide a strategic advisory and insight on like the patient's perspective, whether it's on a particular therapeutic area, but it's really comprised of patients and their caregivers in that advisory capacity. And they're often started very early on in the study planning, and they continue right through CSR. But, those advisory panels, they can look at study documents, summaries of existing data, recruitment and retention plans, and their engagement can look, in a variety of different ways, depending on what's appropriate for the study design, but it could be roundtables, one-on-one interviews, survey completions, testing out equipment. But really, ultimately, the goal is to provide feedback on every aspect of the study for the sponsor to better understand that patient journey and that patient perspective. And really important to include that patient voice, I think, as a part of the planning, early in the planning stages, and carrying that right through, so that we can kind of do a couple of things: lessen the burden of patients may face in participating in a trial, but also really ensuring that informed consent is a true process throughout that kind of trial life cycle. I think there are some other measures, and that may be like, thinking about providing study information to patients in a really accessible way. So we've been hearing a lot of like really exciting conversation and specific activities around providing that information in visual aids or multimedia, audiovisual presentations. And again, the opportunity to do that throughout the life cycle of the trial. And it helps to ensure that informed consent is a process, but also prevents those feelings of overwhelmed of information being kind of brought to a patient or a participant at the early onset of a trial. The other thing I think is important to talk about here is I think it's important to think about educating sites on the study and the consent process so that they can thoroughly address patient questions and needs for the trial. If a patient has particular questions, maybe about a specific assessment, and site staff aren't able to answer those questions, it can really impact recruitment efforts. And we oftentimes think the SIV training is sufficient to really initiate a site. But, I think we're finding here at Halloran, it may be taking it a step further to really ensure that site staff have the necessary resources and training to confidently, communicate and really discuss the trial. And then I think the other kind of strategy or method is for sponsors to think about a feedback loop and really request feedback from patients as well as sites throughout the duration of the trial, and certainly right through the end of the trial. And that feedback, I think, as long as they're addressing it in a timely manner, and some of it you can communicate how you're implementing certain pieces, others may not be appropriate to implement, based on study design, et cetera. But I think that feedback loop really kind of shares a couple of things. I think it says, number one, you're really listening to patients and thinking about informed consent as a process, but also it serves sponsors the opportunity to really integrate some of that feedback in future state study design. So different things to think about there.
Thanks, Meg.
Yeah.
And with any process, there's also, a set of documentation and other compliance elements. Laura, is that something you could talk to?
Yes, thanks, Karen. I was going to chime in from a quality perspective. So we saw in the polling question that I think it was over 50% of top inspection findings was inadequate documentation of the informed consent process. So it's really key that that documentation is clear and stands up under inspection, that you really allow the participant ample time to review the informed consent document and ask questions. That the PI was available, as Megan talked about, or study staff were able to answer those questions, that no research activities were initiated prior to the obtaining the consent, and that the participant received a copy of the consent. So these items need to be clearly stated in study documentation for the visit when informed consent procedures are conducted at that visit.
You know,
Great.
and Karen, if I could, I think, you know, the other thing I'd love to kind of bring in here is around kind of that data perspective, because I think that's really important. And Karen, I know you do a lot in this space as well. So I'd love, you know, for you to chime in here too. But, you know, I think the other thing, we're seeing a lot of attention by FDA and others around the integrity of data. So it's really important to ensure that any and all of the data and signatures and the process documentation are collected and really stored in a compliant way to ensure that you have kind of strong integrity of your data. I think some of the newest guidance we're seeing and from the FDA, MHRA, EMA, and Annex 11 really look to sponsors to detail where electronic data is ultimately stored and also who has access to it. I think the interesting thing as we continue to move forward in technology and thinking through new platforms and media, you know, as we conduct certainly consent, but then other kind of protocol activities as well. I think there are some key considerations and some potential challenges around the electronic data storage. You know, for example, I think we've seen participants using apps on their phones, but in not all cases can they control where that data goes and who has access to it. So I think as technology continues to improve and there's different ways that we can simplify a process for participants, but we have to really be thinking about where's that data going to go and who has access to that data. So Karen, I just wanted to bring that piece up.
No, thank you, Meg. I think that's great. We do have one question that I'm going to drop in right now. And I think Krista, Laura, I think it's probably more up your alley, but how all of this is great, right? But how are we getting study sponsors on board with additional costs really that might come with better patient recruitment and some of these different practices? Any thoughts on that?
Sure. So I mean, it's an important question, and I think some, you know, a common challenge. So, you know, one of the things is getting the sponsors on board with all of these concepts that we are talking about, kind of across all of the functional areas, and many sponsors, you know, rightly so, are trying to become more patient centric, and so really emphasizing this as a key part of that objective. You know, will focus, you know, what you spend your money on, and then also, you know, helping your internal folks to just understand that a patient has a decision, right? They can choose whether to be in a study or not. So the more accessible and understandable you can make this, you know, study during the consent process, facilitating sites and helping patients to understand, the more that you can do that, the more likely you are to actually be able to enroll that one additional patient. You know, one less patient refusing the study is, you know, worth its weight in gold. So I think those are some of the strategies to frame this guidance.
I would also say, and chime in from a quality perspective, I think it's buying into that, establishing a culture of quality that we can talk about in terms of getting the sponsors on board. So really showing at the sites that you're working on establishing that culture of quality, being inspection ready, and also a training component is involved in this as well, really showing that your site staff are sufficiently educated, as Megan pointed out, to answer questions, that they can conduct that informed consent process. And that's only going to help patient engagement and that communication that needs to be ongoing.
Thank you. Thank you for that, Krista.
Karen,
Laura. Oh,
Karen,
yeah, sure. Go ahead.
Yeah, there's one other thing I think that folks may know and may have seen these articles, but Ken Getz from Tufts has just unbelievable studies on this, and happy to, maybe Maria, I'm thinking as a result, we can kind of send those out potentially, and link to those. But he's really demonstrated that investing like 100,000 on patient engagement activities could reduce protocol amendments, accelerated recruitment and enrollment, improved retention, and actually results in a return on investment of about over 500 times. So essentially it's 100K is substantially lower, right, than 141K or, 535K, which we tend to see if you're not paying attention to those different pieces up front. So happy to kind of share links to those articles, because that may be helpful for those of you who are interested in that question, to help make that argument to those study sponsors.
Yeah, definitely watching the chat here, some interest in receiving those links. So I think we can probably send those out, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
So I think this kind of is an interesting follow-on to that question. Meg brought up some really interesting things and new ways we can do the informed consent. And so maybe Krista, you can start on this. What are some of the ways you're seeing that we can make the informed consent form more digestible? And then I think as the flip side to that, what are the objections and the obstacles you're seeing to that, and to making it into kind of accomplishing some of these things?
Sure. So the 2023 final guidance is very consistent with the 2014 draft guidance. FDA has been very clear as far as the logistics for the actual consent document. So reduce the length of the core consent, move the procedural details into an appendix, consider the order in which you're presenting the information, use a simple visit table or other visuals. But we still see a lot of variability in the extent to which sponsors actually take this guidance to heart when they're creating templates to help the sites with their informed consent documents. So I'm just going to touch on some nuts and bolts here. As far as the structure of the document, you can start with this overview that gets to the critical information up front, as though you only had just a couple of pages for the entire consent. Doing that forces you to consider whether some of the details are even necessary to your decision, the patient's decision to participate. And it also kind of drives you to move them to where they're more digestible, to put them in an appendix, and to follow that guidance that the FDA has put out. You can also structure the document in a way that makes it easy for a patient to flip through and find information they want to look up later in the study, because consent is ongoing. And this document really should be useful beyond just the signature that you get on it. And then as far as content, we all know that it needs to be in a language that's understandable to the patient. And that includes literacy level, but it also includes comprehension level. Things like dialects and translation. I mean, the information is going to be more accessible if the language and the images used are sensitive to the culture of the population in the regions that are participating. Will also be more accessible if the tone is conversational and not just medical. So just think radically about your content. Think radically about visual versus text. If you were presenting this information in PowerPoint, how would you do it differently? And, as far as challenges, I mean, it's granted some IRBs still have limitations on what they'll accept for the ICF document itself. So visuals might be considered other materials, and that's fine. It's all part of the consent process that we've been talking about. And I know everything that we're saying sounds great, but there are just these challenges to implementation. 3 of them are time, and time, right? So everyone's rushing to get the first patient in. We'll say we'll improve things in the next version. But just like to be a truly patient-centric sponsor, really need to kind of, say and believe that the first patient deserves to be as well informed as the last, and, help to drive that culture and thought throughout your organization. And it's a challenge, right? To bring our whole organizations on board with these concepts. And one of the things we hear a lot is that usually legal, but sometimes other functions extend the length and the complexity of consent during review. And some strategies to manage this, that we've seen work have been to be clear about who the final decision makers are for each section of the document, for clinical to be that relentless voice of the patient, for regulatory to reinforce that, simplification guidance from the FDA. So those are some things, but I know that everyone on this call has some strategies for managing challenges, and we would really love to hear if you care to share those with other folks, because I think everyone here has a ton of experience with consent.
Great. Thank you, Krista. So I think, we've talked a lot about getting the initial informed consent, but as we all know, changes happen a lot, right, throughout the course of a trial. So what are some of the ways sponsor can really ensure that continued communication, right, and that continued process of making sure the patient's informed? I think, Krista, do you want to continue on that?
I would love to continue on that because this has been one of my pet peeves for years. And I love that the 2023 guidance has actually changed its tune as far as new information for existing patients. So you can provide, as Laura mentioned, an information sheet. You just that updated information to the patient and have that existing patient sign off on just the new information and not have to re-sign the entire consent document, which I think is a wonderful change. I think that it makes things much easier for a patient to understand, less confusing, and it really helps the sites to meet the patient wherever they are in the study. So that's one of my favorite parts about this guidance. If a person can have a favorite part about an FDA guidance.
Well, we're glad you do, Krista. Anybody else? Meg, do you have any thoughts?
Yeah, no, and I think the other piece about the guidance that is interesting too is around the participants who've completed the study. So the guidance also now states that you don't have to kind of share that new information with the participants who've completed the study. Obviously, if that new information relates to risks that would manifest kind of beyond the completion of the study, certainly. But I think I'll just kind of add in, a few things that I mentioned earlier. I think as you're looking, as kind of changes in the trial may happen, again, that feedback loop and that ongoing process of collecting, gathering, and kind of that exchange of information between the sites and the sponsor and the patients is really important and a great strategy for as you think about changing course. And then I just reiterating what Krista said, just simplifying those documents, really leaning into that guidance. And thinking about the use of addendums, appendices, and the information sheets, but also, what are some strategies to really assessing patient and participant comprehension along the way? Again, multimedia, audio, visual presentations could really help with that. And then, and maybe sometimes it might be extended discussions with patients or using decisional aids. As like additional strategies as you think about kind of changing course. I don't know, Krista, I think those may be some other strategies you might agree with too.
Oh, absolutely. And I think that the new guidance, it really does, as Laura mentioned, it leaves it more to the IRBs to help determine what's best, for providing new information. And there are lots of strategies, but they need to be adapted to, what's appropriate for your patient population, for what their capabilities are, and you do have to take into consideration, as you mentioned, the costs and whatever your restrictions are, and really adapt things to what you can do for your study. I would also throw in one small logistical item, that if you do update the entire consent document, for heaven's sake, please provide a red-lined version for your sites and don't make them ask for it. That will go a long way in making you a sponsor of choice.
I would also point out, just from a quality perspective, there's already a mechanism in place to maintain this facilitation of constant, or not constant, but streamlined communication with the patient. Sites are required to maintain a subject identification code list as part of ICH E6R2 essential document list. And that's just a confidential document that contains the participant's contact information. So from a sponsor view, the monitor should be really routinely verifying the existence of this site identification list, as well as that the site staff are continually updating it to ensure compliance. So that really provides that mechanism to continue that communication, as Megan and Krista, as you implement those strategies to occur if it's applicable for the participant.
Thanks, Laura. That's a great point. That's probably easy to forget. So we talk, and I think it's been big in the industry for a while now, about really working with underrepresented populations. Meg, how would you, recommend or talk to people about, how do you adapt that ICF process and communication to some of the more underrepresented populations?
Yeah, I think, for patients or participants, who we would describe as underrepresented or for whom we've historically had challenges targeting for particular trials, it's really important to think about informed consent as a process. Again, those advisory panels that I had talked about before, even thinking through working with, patient advocacy groups, kind of with patients and families to really, again, have that clear understanding of disease progression and the patient experience with their disease or their condition. And I would say for any population that we're working with, but particularly for those who, again, we've had, historically have had a difficult time targeting for certain trials, considering cultural, lingual, language literacy, health literacy are all really important considerations in developing both the process as well as documents that are related to informed consent. And I think Krista had mentioned this earlier, that includes this balance between kind of conversational communication methods and styles and that more medical tone to really ensure that you're engaging, appropriately and effectively with your patients. And I think there's been some interesting conversation around this, particularly as we think about health literacy and language literacy, and the use of AI to help with decreasing that cycle time for translation and literacy activities across multiple trial documents, but certainly informed consent documentation would work into that as well. I think the asterisk on that is really paying attention when you're doing that and ensuring that you're doing it behind a firewall to protect your IP and your company information. But again, some exciting things I think are coming around the use of AI to potentially help really in this space. But I think across all of those different strategies or key considerations, really the ultimate goal in that process, and certainly in the documents that kind of work you through that process, to really ensure, that patients really understand the objectives and the endpoints of the trial, the risks, the therapies, the procedures that are involved. And I think the piece that we sometimes forget to include, but is really critical, is for participants to truly understand the contribution and the impact that they have on the research that they're participating in. I think that goes a long way in terms of patient engagement, but it really is, again, a mind shift as you think about consent throughout the trial life cycle.
I would also, add just from a slightly different perspective as far as vulnerable populations. We kind of, typically have thought of them as, pediatric, cognitively impaired. But this final guidance also emphasizes that vulnerability can be situational. So, if a patient is going to be, prepping for surgery while they're being consented, or, if they've just learned that they've progressed that their cancer has progressed and there's nothing left for them but a clinical trial, they're a vulnerable position just because of the situation that they're in, and that needs to be taken into account as far as how the consent process is conducted. Also, if there is not sufficient information for them to understand the true cost of participating, as far as their time they need to take off work, their need for childcare, transportation, how that might be covered, co-pays, that not having that level of information makes them vulnerable as well. And then finally, a participant can be vulnerable to an undue influence just in the connotation of certain words. So FDA has kind of doubled down on not using words that imply a benefit when there isn't. So, if your study product, is experimental, don't refer to it as a therapeutic. And those are all wrapped up in the concept of vulnerability that's a little different, than in years past. So, oh, and one last thing, actually, that potential participants may not also be eligible and competent to provide consent, but have a physical or a sensory disability that impedes their access to the information. So there is an expectation that reasonable modifications, auxiliary aids, and services should be provided. And that's something, you know, we're talking about all of these things that are, you know, largely the responsibility of the investigator, but that from a sponsor side, what you can do to help facilitate that and make this process go better for the patients at the sites.
Great. Any last thoughts, Krista, Laura, Meg, kind of any key takeaways you'd really like to, you know, for the audience to really come home to as your key lessons from the informed consent process and the new guidance?
I think for me, it's, you know, again, these are things that we've been saying, but I think thinking of informed consent as a true process and not a check the box activity of you know, having the form itself, and that requires a lot of work, and that's not, you know, it's, you know, I'm not saying that lightly, but really thinking about it, you know, at the point of protocol development and starting to think through the trial design, I think will really, it's going to go a long way. And again, I'll send out, you know, as a result of this, I'll send out the links to those articles that I was talking about before. But, you know, there's definitely evidence on the, you know, return on investment and really having those kind of patient-centric a focus and really thinking through informed consent as a true process.
And I
Great.
think to follow up with Megan, oh, Karen, I was just going to say the process is huge and documentation of that process is very important. So we talk about that informed consent isn't just a signature on a informed consent form, right? But the documentation around the process and how you facilitated that patient's understanding and allowed them time to review it is going to be key as well.
So one last question that came up, you know, what's a pointed question that a sponsor can ask during a site qualification visit to really know that the investigator is qualified to obtain informed consent and that they have the right processes? I think that was one of the things we saw in terms of findings and one of the questions. So any thoughts on that? Laura?
Yes, I was coming off mute.
Sorry.
So yes, I think this is really important because the sponsor is delegating, right, to the site and the investigator to conduct that informed consent process, but they're still accountable and responsible for it and oversight. So key is to understand the detailed plan around oversight that the investigator has of the delegated staff that are performing that consent process, and also understanding what their training looks like. Is the investigator observing site staff, for example, conduct that informed consent, essentially vetting that they are able to answer those participant questions? How prepared are they in terms of education about the study to be answering that? I think that's going to be key for the sponsor to determine during site qualification to really ensure that that investigator and their site staff are adequately prepared and able to conduct that informed consent process.
And there's also, you can come at it at a more oblique angle during pre-qualification or during initiation, and just, you know, ask a question as though you are a patient, you know, what are the other, you know, alternatives to treatments, you know, from this, you know, help me to understand that, just sort of ask those questions and see how they answer. And it also can trigger them, if they can't answer, to think, oh, I need to get my act together before I talk to the patient in case these things come up. And it's a little less pointed, but it gets to the information as well.
Great. So do we have any questions from any of our audience members? That's the bulk of our content for today, but would love to open it up to questions or any discussion points that people have.
You can unmute yourselves or just drop them into the chat.
Question, has anyone, and this could be for other participants as well as our panel, but has anyone used a pre-recorded video that sites can use for patients to watch as an additional tool to support the ICF process?
Yes, this definitely is. It's very useful if, particularly if you have a complex delivery or administration. I've seen it used on, with stereotactic neurosurgery to just help the patients visualize what's going into their head, how it's going to diffuse once it gets in there, and it just really helps the patient understand the administration process. So if you have complex procedures like that, it can be very helpful. And it doesn't have to be, super complicated. This video, it can really take extracts from what you use, for training for your pharmacist or proceduralist. So you can kind of repackage what you use for other purposes for this, but it can be very helpful for the patient.
Okay, lots of questions coming in. So, and I guess I'll open this up to anyone, but is there an FDA thought on using e-consent versus paper now, since e-consent can put in quizzes, videos, visuals, etc.? Anybody have?
Meg, I thought you might have had some experience with that, with consents that actually prompt patients with comprehension questions just on tablet as they go through. I wonder if you had any more insight into that.
Yeah, so I mean, definitely people are using them. And I think, again, the key part here is, certainly when it comes to e-consent, ensuring that it, kind of fits with the patient population. And then also, again, we go back to the collection of that and where it's housed, and the access to that is really important as well. But I don't know if others on the call have used e-consent.
Haven't.
Yeah.
Okay. Let's see here. Lots of questions about templates. And I think anybody, that's probably a question, reach out to any of us and we can talk about that one-on-one in terms of what you'd like for templates, and we can talk about how Halloran could help there. And then unless anybody has anything specific around templates, Krista, Laura, Megan.
I think just like you said, Karen, to reach out to us individually. They're definitely it's case by case.
Yeah.
But
so question, how do we get local site IRBs on board with using e-consent?
I think I'll chime in there as a former IRB member, Karen.
Okay, that's great.
It's really important, and sometimes it's very beneficial for you to have conversations with your IRB early on prior to submission. What I have found helpful from being an IRB member, but also trying to get things approved by the IRB, is also asking for some time for a presentation, maybe in a subcommittee or one of their committees, to just kind of present what you're trying to do, the risk, and also what's really important, the benefits behind it. Because sometimes once you have that conversation with the IRB and they're able to dialogue with you to better understand, they are more apt to be willing to adopt that e-consent process or a unique visual aid, for example.
Great. And the last question we have, and this is a loaded one, but what are you seeing in terms of the use of AI to tailor informed consents? And I know that's an area at Halloran we're looking into quite a bit right now. So I don't know if anybody has any specific experience with that, Krista, if you've seen anything.
honestly, I have not yet. And I think that there has been some conversation, Meg, again, that we've engaged in around this, but I've not seen it implemented yet.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and Karen, I think the conversations that we've heard are really early in the conversation, and I think people are still trying to wrap their mind around AI and how to use it. But then I think how to really protect your company information in doing that. So if you're plugging in, let's say you have an informed consent form, you're like, how do I ensure that this is at a third grade reading level? So ChatGPT can do that for you, but remember, anything you're putting out is going out. to everyone. So ensuring that, and I think companies are kind of looking at, and sponsors are looking at, how do you create that firewall so you can do some of that work inside. But
Yeah.
I still think it's
And
pretty
we do
early.
know a number of companies working in that space.
Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah.
But it's really exciting. I think the potential to use it, and, translation services, for example, can be multiple weeks to get informed consent forms and other documents translated. And so the opportunity to be able to decrease that cycle time is pretty exciting.
Great. So I don't see any other questions, but if anybody does have additional questions after we conclude today, feel free to reach out. We put our code up here. You can stay connected with us. Would love to hear from anyone. So I think on behalf of everyone at Halloran and all our participants, thank you all for joining today. I think it was a great discussion and we appreciate all of your time.
Karen, I just wanted to add that there will
Oh,
be
sorry.
key takeaways that we will send to all of the participants today post the breakfast. So within a couple of days, we'll send those out with the recording as well.
Thank you. Sorry, Maria. I was probably
no.
supposed to say that.
No problem at all. Great
All
job,
right.
everyone.
Thank you, everyone.
Thanks for joining us today.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.